In 1969, Bob Gore, while working for his father Wilbert, aka Bill, took a rod of polytetrafluoroethylene and stretched it out. This unexpectedly created an entirely new material they called expanded polytetrafluoroethylene. Very creative. The basis for a product commonly known as GORE-TEX. The product was wildly successful as a component of rain gear and some lesser-known applications such as medical devices. W.L. Gore and Associates reportedly has nearly $5 billion in annual revenue today and employs over 10,000 people. This makes it one of the larger privately held corporations in America. And this is why when the company's original shareholders, Bill and his wife Genevieve, passed away, the family was in the midst of one of the weirdest inheritance battles you can possibly imagine.
My father got a deal from a friend of his. It's GORE-TEX. You know about GORE-TEX?
Okay, Bill and Genevieve are the founders of the company in 1958. They have 5 children: Robert, Susan, Virginia, David, and Elizabeth. By 1965, each of these children have been granted 3,900 shares of W.L. Gore, while Bill and Genevieve have about 7,000 themselves. Sorry if this sounds like the start of a math problem, but in some ways it kind of is one. In 1972, it was becoming obvious that GORE-TEX was about to make the family very wealthy. Bill begins thinking about inheritance, and he's afraid that if he dies and his shares go to all his children, they'll have this massive tax bill they have to deal with, and the only way they can come up with the funds to cover the tax is through selling shares. But if they all had to do this, there was a chance the family could lose control of the company to whoever was buying those shares. So he goes ahead and sets up some trusts that will bear the burden of the taxes. And while he does this, he also decides to set up a formula for how his shares will be distributed. He wants all of his grandchildren to be the recipients of equal amounts of shares. However, this does not mean that he will give them all equal amounts of shares. First, he assumes that his children will distribute their shares among the grandchildren, and then he'll use his to kind of top off their holdings so they all end up in the same place. So let's think about a simple example to maybe see what this means. Dan has 12 shares and 2 children, and each of those children have 2 shares and 2 children of their own. So Dan has 4 grandchildren. There are 16 shares in the company to go around. If Dan wants all of his grandchildren to end up the same, he'll assume that each of them will receive 1 of their parents' shares, and then he's going to leave 3 of his shares to each of them. So they all have 4. Now, to see how things can get weird, let's assume the same facts, except one of Dan's children has 3 children of their own and the other has only 1. So the same number of grandchildren. In this case, Dan will assume that the only child receives both of her parents' shares and then gives her 2 of his 12, making 4. Dan will assume that in the 3-child family, each receives 2/3 of a share, and then he gives 3 1/3 of his 12 to each of them to get them to 4. So again, all the grandchildren end up with 4 shares, so the offspring are on equal footing. But on the other hand, one of Dan's children effectively received over 80% of his fortune, and the other only got like 16%. It's an open question as to whether or not that's fair. Back to the real world. Bill Gore's children, Robert, Virginia, David, and Elizabeth, each have 4 children of their own. Susan Gore has 3. And guess which of the 5 lineages is weird? Susan gets divorced. She gets deep into transcendental meditation and then describes that practice as leaving her in, quote, very, very bad shape. She's nearly bankrupt and even sold some of her 3,900 shares to stay afloat, although we'll ignore that for purposes of keeping this simple. One of her children, Nathan, turns into one of those rich kids who's obsessed with class and status. This culminates in him making a presentation to other family members, kind of stepbrothers style, called, quote, Tangible Effects of the Belief Space, making a successful transition from nouveau riches to sustainable wealth.
Excuse me, everyone. on, if I could have your attention, please.
He wants W.L. Gore and Associates to go public and has imagined a way to make this happen while still letting the family retain control of the company. His thesis is that the family has been held back by a mindset that, quote, anything above middle-class lifestyle is ostentatious, wasteful, and bad, which keeps the family fragmented and keeps family members from working together due to time, work, and travel constraints, violates the birthright of wealth. That must have been a fun Thanksgiving after he gave that presentation. As expected, Nathan's fixation on his family's wealth led him to examine the inheritance formula and explain the unfairness of it to his mother, Susan. Nathan thought he had a plan, though. Susan, though too old to have another child, could adopt one. At this point, she had a grandchild of her own, and Nathan suggested that would be perfect. Her ex-husband, Jan, grandfather of the child in question, objects, though. Nathan then makes an appeal to his grandmother, who has outlived Bill at this point, at her 90th birthday party that the court documents describe as, quote, forceful and passionate. Can you imagine? Basically, you're yelling at a woman who's 90 years old on her birthday because the millions you will receive aren't good enough. Anyway, to her credit, she says no. Nathan has his mom's ear, though. Susan hasn't been allowed to adopt her grandchild, but there could be other targets.
Is that your son?
No, I just bought this baby cash.
Maybe a real baby in search of a home? Of course not. Instead, Susan's ex-husband jokes that she could adopt him. He wouldn't even take his part of the money. He'd just let it pass to the 3 children that he'd had with Susan. Susan doesn't think this is a joke. She thinks this is a good idea. So on July 10th, 2003, Susan adopts Jan Otto, her ex-husband, keeping the secret from the other 4 families. He is 65 years old, technically now the sibling of his 3 children, and more importantly, the 20th grandchild of Bill and Genevieve. Some time passes, and Jan begins having second thoughts. Not about the adoption, though, about passing his inheritance to the other 3 kids. He decides he'd like to keep it for himself. Susan writes to her children in a panic, asking them if she should unadopt their dad. And while that is in play, Genevieve dies, triggering the trust. At this point, the other family members find out about the secret adoption, and obviously everything ends up in court. First, it was ruled that Jan couldn't be the financial beneficiary because thankfully he had signed documents originally saying that he was just kind of doing this for the kids. Then the court got what I think is extremely lucky. The adoption was 100% legal under Wyoming law. However, although the term child was clearly defined in the document and specifically referenced adoption as being viable, the document did not define grandchild. The court then had the wiggle room to determine that Jan was not in fact their grandchild for the purposes of the trust. W.L. Gore remains a private company controlled by the descendants of Bill and Genevieve to this day. In 2020, Brett Snyder, one of the 19 beneficiaries of the trust from one of the normal families, became CEO. The last confirmed info I found on Nathan from 10 years back was that he was running an executive coaching business with the tagline, Transform, Transcend. Perfect. Thanks for watching, guys.